It's to get people to share their stories with their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids.
Joining us in the studio today is English instructor Gilbert Benton. Gilbert is going to talk to us about his life writing class here at the college. So Gilbert, tell me a little bit about your course and kind of like why you think a lot of people are interested in using it.
Okay, well, I really wish we had more people. We started this class because my mother was taking a class like this over at College of the Mainland. And I went in to whoever it was in those days and said, why don't we have this class? And it was that answer. Well, if you'll teach it, we'll do it. And I said, fine. And we did it. The earliest roll sheet I could find on my computer was 1998. But we had two. We had one here and one in Pearland. And I know we had 3 years before that, so we've been doing this class a long time. And it's just a place where I can get people to come in and tell their story. They write it. I have it set up so that everybody has 10 minutes, and they write it in before, they bring it in, they read. The best part, other than the stories, the best part is all the discussion we get in between the stories. And what's really cool is when I see people writing notes because, oh yeah, I think about that, and they write their stories. I have a whole list of questions here that came up as we were writing stories. I would write these questions down. So then I put them together and handed them out. It's a place that is a safe place for seniors. It's a very good social setting, and they get to come in. When we first did it, a lot of the ladies, they got all dressed up and came, because this was it was like going to church or something, it was a social setting. And it's a safe place. You can feel comfortable. A lot of people feel scared because they say, I can't write very well.
Right.
I don't spell. And I said, this is not a class where I'm going to take up your paper and grade them and give them back to you.
Well, and there's a reticence to just sharing their lives in general anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of them want to do it just for their own.
Yeah. Well, that's what I tell people. Whenever I go out and talk about this class, I always have people come up and tell me stories. Oh, I did this and I did. And I say, you need to write that, And we were just talking about it in class. I told him, I said, I'm going to go do this podcast. It's a good place to come. And, for several years, my mom came with me to this class. We went to the Pearland class first. And then when we sold the school over there, remember when the college had the school over there, and we sold it. And so I asked those folks, I said, would you be willing to come to the campus? And it was great because we had everybody together, and we had maybe 10, 11 at the most. There was one time we had probably 18 people in the class, and it didn't work because there were too many people who didn't get to read. So I told them, stop at 10. Don't let more than 10 people in because that way we have plenty of time to read and to talk. I tell people, I don't want you to write like an English teacher unless you are an English teacher. I want your kids and grandkids to hear your story and say, that's Grandma talking. That's exactly how she talked. And
so kind of finding a voice.
Yeah. And it's hard. It's hard sometimes to start talking about yourself. I've had some really interesting people in the class. I don't know if you remember Joe Rosano. Joe was the mayor of Alvin. He was a dean here at the school. He and his wife, Joan, both took the class. And it's always fun when I get a husband and wife in there because the husband will be writing and the wife is shaking her head, no, that's not how it went, And
it's not how they remembered it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, one time after Joe had been in the class 3 or 4 semesters, he said, today I'm going to talk about my uncle. And I said, wait, Joe, is this your uncle that went into the war? Or is this your uncle that owned the store where you went to work before you were old enough to get a certificate? And he says, how do you know that? And I said, Joe, I know your whole family, man. And that's how it is. We get to the point. One of the ladies, I told her, for your family, we need a big spreadsheet on the wall to keep up with who everybody is, that kind of stuff. And it's really cool. I ask them questions. Well, let me read you a couple of these questions. What was your favorite movie as a kid, as a young adult, as an adult? Who were your favorite stars? Why? Did you ever meet any? What was the first movie you ever saw? And then I say, was it a talkie or silent? Just kidding. But when I started, there were some that were watch the silent movies, I asked them about who's the most famous person you ever met. And my mother was an Army nurse during the war. She was in, I guess, what we would call a MASH hospital. Now, she landed at Normandy, and they went, as the Army went, and she was finally ended up in Paris. Well, actually, she was in Germany. I asked her, and she said, well, I met General Eisenhower. I said, tell me about it, Mom. She said, well, we were in France, This big chateau we had taken, the doctors on the top floor, nurses on the second floor, and the whole bottom floor was the ward. And we would slide down the banisters to do our early morning rounds. And I did that, and I fell, and I looked up, and there was General Eisenhower. And I said, "What did you do, Mom?" She says, "I snapped to attention like a good second lieutenant. I saluted, and I got out of there." And he was laughing when I left. And I said, "Well, at that point, Mom, Ike probably was happy because
Well, it was probably one of the more amusing things he saw at that point in his life, I'm sure.
Exactly. Ike always liked a good-looking nurse anyway, But things like that. And I've had, people tell me about just random people that they met that were really famous, things like that.
So what is kind of the purpose of the questions? Like, is it just kind of to spur thinking?
Yes. Kind
of to inspire them to...
Yeah. When we first started the class, we called it creative writing. And after a couple of semesters, I said, "You guys, it may be creative writing because I don't know if what you're telling me is true or not because this is your story, but we need a better name." And one guy says, "Writing our life story, why don't we call it life story writing?" I said, that was so simple, Yeah. And so it's to get people to share their stories with their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. I've been to too many funerals for people who were in the class, but almost every one, somebody in the family comes up when I tell them who I am, and they say, "Thank you. If it wasn't for that class, there's so much about Pop that we wouldn't know." And I said, that's what this class is for.
How do they go from formulating thoughts? How do they go from, you've asked them a question, their gears are turning. Mm-hmm. Is it an issue of do they write it like physically handwritten, or or does it vary per person? Like, I'm curious how it translates from, the thinking process and because, memory is reconstructed, to that process to putting it down.
Well, it's really funny because one of the guys who's in the class now brings his laptop. He reads his story on his laptop. Most of the people type them and bring them in. One of the ladies who just started this semester read hers off of her phone one day. And I said,
well, it's easy because now you can take your phone, you can dictate into a Google Doc. And
I told her, I said, "Well, you need to make it a little bit bigger. If I did that, I'd have it one word at a time, It's really cool. Most of them now type. They put it on their computers. And when I first started, most everybody hand wrote their papers, and like my mom would sit down, she would have all these questions. I found a book finally that said how to write your life story, and it divided it up: young years, elementary, birth, elementary, junior high, high school, work, children, retirement, things like that. And I said, you can do it like that. You can just start anywhere you are and go forward or backwards. It's your story. Do it how you want to. Most of them, they think about it because they have a whole week. Although some of them still say, "Well, I didn't start writing until last night at 11 o'clock. And I said, "You're just like my students were, man. You're supposed to write this stuff in advance, But it's really neat because I see them with handwritten. I see them with typed stories, and they write around the edges, around, up the side of the page, filling in stuff that they are changing their stories and stuff like that. And it's a process that they're still, one guy said today, this is a first draft, what I'm reading in here. One of the men who's in the class now is a Vietnam vet. And he started the class with letters that he had written home, plus his journals, and he was writing his story. And I told him, "I'm so glad you're sharing this with us." And he said, "I want you to know this is the first time I've ever shared this with anybody." And we all said, "We are so honored that you chose us."
Right.
And it's things like that.
It's hard for veterans to talk about that.
Exactly.
In general, so.
Exactly. And one of the men who was in the class, 2015, he grew up on a farm in Iuka, Mississippi, and he grew up there. He moved around. They lived in different little houses, whatever his dad could. They farmed, they hunted, and he started there, and he and his brother were cotton pickers. And he said, "I was going to go for this contest. It was like $100 prize, and I was the best cotton picker." And my brother started the car, and I jumped up and grabbed, and the door slammed, and cut the end of my finger off and cut off my cotton picking. I mean, just things like that are so cool. And they talk about early on, all of the people were pretty close to the same age. Mm-hmm. And they would talk about growing up during the Depression. And they'd all sit there nodding their heads because they all understood what they were talking about. One lady, it's fun for me when I get people from different places. I love it when I have all people who grew up in Texas, but I had a lady from Wisconsin, and she was talking about living on the farm, and the snow was so thick that her dad had to dig a tunnel to the barn to feed the cows, and he got his tractor out and made a path for them to go catch the school bus. And I said, wow, it was just like that for me when I was growing up in Galveston. We had snow so deep,
Which
But
that comes from sharing and writing that story.
Yeah, and it's so cool because the people that grew up in New York in the Depression had the same things happen to them that the people who grew up in Baytown, like my mother, grew up in Pelly, Texas. It's the best class I've ever had because I hear the best stories I've ever heard, and I don't have to grade anything. That's my favorite part.
Well, the grade is what they get out of it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's so neat because they hear each other's stories, and they'll talk. Oh yeah, I did that. We had 3 guys who grew up picking cotton, and they would swap cotton picking stories. Mm-hmm. I just sit there and thought, that is so cool. I'm glad I didn't grow up on a farm and have to do that.
So you started in the 90s. That's right when the internet was kind of coming into its being. And that's when the internet started. That's when blogging started. Mm-hmm. So all the times you started, you said, remember when in the first class you said they were handwritten, mm-hmm. now they're on laptops and now they're on phones.
Yeah.
Have you seen a sort of progression in how technology has changed the way people express themselves between handwriting to electronic and now a lot of people are podcasting, they're recording, they're doing oral histories of themselves.
When they're doing their life story, it's all about the same, no matter whether they put it on their computer or they handwrite it, because I'm trying to say what I felt and I'm trying to give you the memories that I have of that time. Mm-hmm. And whether they type it on their computer or handwrite it, I think the process is still the same. There's just some people that don't like to do handwritten and some people who don't like to type it out. My mom would write all of her stories and I would type them, and we'd find pictures, and I would put the pictures in with her stories. I mean, that's why I keep telling people, this is so cool. I have my mother's whole story from what she remembers about what she was told when she was born, all the way up till maybe 3 weeks before she passed away. She was living with us, and we'd go to class, and I'd say, Mom, got to have a story. I'm going to read one of my old ones. Nope, got to write a new one. Why? Because you're doing physical therapy, you got to do mental therapy, And that's one of the good things about the class is the mental therapy that it gives. Some of these seniors, they have church, they have kids in this class, and that's it. And it's a great service. I think this is such an important class because leaving your story for your family is very important. All of the years that I sat and listened to my grandparents and didn't listen, and whenever I go out and talk about this class, I'll tell people, do you remember when you wouldn't listen to your grandparents and your parents talk about the old days? And they said, yeah. And I said, aren't you sorry now? And they say, yeah. And I said, that's what this class is for. It's very important for this generation to pass it down to the next and the next and the next. And if you have it all typed out, or if you have it like I have my mom's on my computer, and when some of my cousins say, do you have that story about? So I said, yep, I'll send you the whole book. So that's what's important. It's to pass this stuff down from generation to generation. One of the ladies challenged me 25 years ago, because my grandson's 25 now, are you writing? I said, no. And so I said, all right, I will. So I sat down every week and wrote to my brand new grandson and told him what he was doing and what his mother did at that age, And I did that for both of my first 2 grandsons. And now I have started going back writing stories about my life because my sisters are younger than me and they don't remember growing up in Galveston, and I'm telling them stories about how we would walk to the beach from where we lived, and I asked Mom, how do we get over the seawall? She says, it wasn't there. It didn't come out that far, and things like that. But this is so important for people to pass their story, their history down to their kids and their grandkids and on and on and on.
To learn more about the Life Story class, call 281-756-3787 or visit allencollege.edu/CEWD and click on Community Programs. Thank you for listening. To read about these stories and more, visit allencollege.edu.